Sometimes the thing that saves your life arrives looking like junk mail. At 2:13 in the morning, Daniel Carter was sitting alone at a second-hand kitchen table that wobbled every time he moved his elbow. The apartment was barely 600 square feet, tucked above a closed hardware store on the edge of a quiet Ohio town. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. Inside, the only light came from an aging laptop and a lamp with a cracked beige shade. 6 months earlier, Daniel had lived in a 4-bedroom house with a 3-car garage. Now he lived in a place where he could hear his neighbor's television through the wall. The divorce had taken more than his marriage. It had taken his routines, his plans, and most of the life he had spent nearly 20 years building. His ex-wife, Rebecca Carter, had walked away from the courtroom with the house, the vacation property, most of the investment accounts, and enough confidence to celebrate her victory before the paperwork was even finalized. Daniel remembered the sound of her laughter echoing through the courthouse hallway that day. Not cruel. Not loud. Just certain. Certain that the story was over. Certain that she had won. For 6 months, Daniel had tried not to think about it. He worked long shifts. Paid bills. Learned how to stretch a grocery budget. Learned how to sleep in a room that didn't feel like home. Learned how quiet life could become when people chose sides. Friends he had known for years stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. Even family gatherings felt different. Everyone seemed uncomfortable around failure, especially when it arrived wearing a suit and carrying divorce papers. The laptop screen glowed in front of him. He had opened it only to check his bank account before going to bed. Payday was still 3 days away. Rent was due in 5. He was calculating numbers in his head when a notification appeared in the corner of the screen. A new email. Daniel almost ignored it. Most late-night emails were advertisements or scams. He reached for his coffee mug and noticed it was empty. Then his eyes drifted back to the screen. The sender's name wasn't familiar. Neither was the company attached to it. For a moment, he considered deleting it without opening it. Instead, he clicked. The subject line contained only 3 words. Regarding Carter Holdings. Daniel frowned. Carter Holdings. He whispered the words to himself. They sounded vaguely familiar, like a song he had not heard in years. He searched his memory. Nothing came immediately. No active business. No current account. No company he recognized. Yet something about the name tugged at him. The email itself was short. Surprisingly short. No sales pitch. No request for money. No suspicious links. Just a brief message asking him to contact an attorney named Michael Bennett regarding an urgent matter connected to Carter Holdings. A phone number sat at the bottom of the screen. That was all. Daniel stared at it for nearly a minute. Then another. Rain continued tapping against the glass. Somewhere downstairs, a delivery truck rolled past on the wet street. The world kept moving. Yet something felt different. Not dramatic. Not magical. Just different. Like standing in front of a locked door and hearing movement on the other side. He leaned back in his chair and read the message again. Then again. The name Michael Bennett meant nothing to him. The company meant almost nothing. But the feeling refused to leave. For the first time in months, Daniel wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about a question. And questions, he would soon learn, could be far more powerful than answers. Daniel did not sleep much after that. The email stayed open on his laptop long after midnight slipped into morning. He read the message so many times that he could practically recite it from memory. Yet every time his eyes moved across the words, the same question returned. Why him? By 7 o'clock, gray clouds still hung over the town. Daniel stood in the kitchen holding a mug of cheap coffee while staring out the narrow window above the sink. The parking lot below glistened from the rain. A delivery van backed into an alley. Someone walked a dog along the sidewalk. Ordinary people beginning ordinary days. Daniel wished his mind felt that simple. Instead, it kept circling back to Carter Holdings. The name felt buried somewhere deep in his memory, trapped beneath years of work deadlines, mortgage payments, and the slow unraveling of a marriage. He grabbed his jacket and headed to work. The warehouse sat nearly 20 miles outside town. Every morning he drove the same route, passing gas stations, cornfields, and faded billboards advertising local injury attorneys. 6 months earlier, he had spent his commute taking conference calls through the Bluetooth system in a luxury SUV. Now he drove a 12-year-old sedan whose air conditioning only worked when it felt like cooperating. The contrast would have bothered him once. Lately, he barely noticed. What bothered him was uncertainty. During his lunch break, Daniel sat alone at a metal table near the loading docks. The smell of cardboard and machine oil filled the air. Around him, coworkers talked about football, weekend plans, and rising grocery prices. Daniel opened his phone and searched for Carter Holdings. Nothing useful appeared. A few unrelated businesses. A handful of outdated records. No obvious connection to him. He typed his father's name into the search bar. Then his grandfather's. Still nothing. The trail seemed to disappear before it even started. By late afternoon, he convinced himself the email was probably a mistake. Maybe someone had contacted the wrong Daniel Carter. Maybe the attorney was searching for another family entirely. The explanation made sense. It should have ended there. But when his shift ended and he returned to the apartment, he found himself opening old boxes stacked against the bedroom wall. Most contained things he had never unpacked after the divorce. Tax records. Family photographs. Manuals for appliances he no longer owned. The remains of a life divided into cardboard containers. Dust floated through the fading sunlight as he sorted through them. In one box, he found a framed photograph of himself and Rebecca from years ago. They looked impossibly young. Both smiling. Both certain about the future. Daniel studied the picture for a moment before placing it face down. Some memories felt heavier than others. Beneath a stack of documents, he discovered an old manila folder with his father's handwriting across the front. The ink had faded, but the letters remained visible. Daniel froze. His father had been gone for nearly 8 years. Most of his paperwork had been settled long ago. Curious, Daniel opened the folder. Inside were aging documents, account statements, and correspondence from companies he did not recognize. His eyes moved across page after page. Then he saw it. 2 familiar words printed near the bottom of a document dated almost 15 years earlier. Carter Holdings. Daniel stared at the page. The room suddenly felt very quiet. The rain had stopped. The traffic outside seemed distant. He looked back at the email on his laptop screen, then down at the document in his hands. For 6 months, life had felt like a story that was already finished. Yet sitting there in a small apartment surrounded by dusty boxes, Daniel began to suspect that the final chapter had never actually been written. Daniel sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight, the manila folder spread open in front of him like pieces of a puzzle nobody had touched in years. The documents were old enough that some of the paper had begun turning yellow around the edges. Most people would have looked at them once and moved on. Daniel almost did. But after seeing the same company name in both the folder and the email, curiosity became impossible to ignore. He began sorting every page into careful stacks. Account statements. Legal correspondence. Tax documents. Handwritten notes from his father. Some of it made little sense at first. The dates stretched back more than a decade. Several companies listed on the paperwork no longer existed. Others had merged into organizations Daniel had never heard of. The deeper he looked, the stranger it felt. His father had always been a practical man. He drove used trucks. Fixed things himself. Rarely talked about money. Daniel could remember countless weekends helping him repair fences, replace water heaters, and mow acres of grass beneath the Ohio summer sun. Yet he could not remember a single conversation about Carter Holdings. Not one. Around 10 o'clock, he found a faded letter clipped to the back of the folder. It appeared to be correspondence between his father and an attorney. The language was formal and difficult to follow, but one sentence caught his attention. It referenced an ownership interest that would remain protected under a long-term structure established for future beneficiaries. Daniel read the sentence twice. Then 3 times. Beneficiaries. The word lingered in his thoughts. His pulse quickened slightly. He immediately forced himself to slow down. The last thing he wanted was to build false hope from legal language he barely understood. Hope had become expensive over the past 6 months. Every time he thought life might improve, reality usually found a way to send the bill. The next morning, he carried the folder to work. During his lunch break, he sat alone again and reviewed every page. One document included a partial account number. Another referenced annual reports. A third contained the name of a law firm located in Chicago. Piece by piece, fragments began connecting. Not enough to reveal the picture. Just enough to prove there was a picture. Meanwhile, life outside the folder continued moving forward. His supervisor asked him to stay late for an inventory count. The warehouse lights buzzed overhead as forklifts moved between towering shelves. Daniel completed the shift, signed out, and drove home beneath a sky painted orange and purple by the setting sun. Usually, exhaustion filled the drive. Tonight something else occupied his mind. Possibility. It was a dangerous feeling because it had been absent for so long. When he reached the apartment, the email still waited in his inbox. Unread since the first night. The phone number remained at the bottom of the message. Simple. Direct. Unremarkable. Daniel poured himself a glass of water and sat quietly at the table. For nearly 10 minutes, he stared at the screen. One call. That was all it would take. One call to learn the truth. One call to discover whether the strange trail of documents meant something or nothing. Yet part of him hesitated. If the email was a mistake, the mystery would end. If it was real, everything might change. Finally, he picked up his phone. His thumb hovered above the number. Then, before doubt could stop him, he pressed call. The line rang once. Twice. 3 times. A calm professional voice answered. Michael Bennett speaking. Daniel took a slow breath. The story he thought had ended 6 months ago had just begun moving in a direction he never saw coming. The voice on the other end of the phone sounded calm, experienced, and surprisingly direct. Mr. Carter, thank you for calling back. Daniel leaned forward in his chair. The apartment suddenly felt smaller. I received your email, he said carefully. I think there may be some mistake. There was a brief pause. Papers shuffled somewhere in the background. I do not believe there is, Michael Bennett replied. Before we continue, I need to verify a few details. The attorney asked several routine questions. Full name. Date of birth. Former address. Information only someone connected to official records would know. Daniel answered each one. With every response, his uncertainty faded slightly. By the end of the verification process, Michael sounded completely confident. Yes, he said. You are exactly the person I have been trying to locate. Daniel glanced toward the manila folder still sitting on the table. Can you tell me what this is about? Again, a pause. Not the pause of someone hiding information. The pause of a professional choosing his words carefully. I can tell you that it relates to a family asset connected to your late father. Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. An asset? Potentially. However, before discussing specifics, I need to review additional documentation with you. Daniel waited for more. Instead, Michael asked a question that caught him completely off guard. Have you recently gone through a divorce? Daniel blinked. Yes. Was a full financial disclosure completed during the proceedings? The question immediately pulled him back 6 months. Courtrooms. Attorneys. Endless paperwork. Financial statements spread across conference tables. Every account he knew about had been disclosed. Every property. Every retirement fund. Every debt. Everything had been examined and divided. As far as I know, yes, Daniel answered. Michael made a note. Interesting. Daniel frowned. Why does that matter? The attorney's voice remained professional. Because some of the records I have reviewed suggest there may be interests connected to your family that were never actively managed in your name. Daniel stared at the wall. I do not understand what that means. At this stage, neither do I completely, Michael admitted. That is why I would like to schedule a formal review. The conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. By the end, Daniel had more questions than answers. Yet one thing became increasingly clear. This was not a scam. Michael never asked for money. Never requested banking information. Never pressured him into signing anything. Instead, he focused on records, history, and verification. After hanging up, Daniel sat quietly. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the parking lot. Somewhere nearby, a train horn echoed through the distance. The familiar sounds of town life continued exactly as they had the day before. Yet Daniel no longer felt like the same man who had opened that email. For months, his future had looked painfully predictable. Work. Bills. Sleep. Repeat. The narrow path of someone rebuilding from scratch. Now a door had appeared where no door existed before. Not an open door. Not yet. Just the outline of one. The following week moved slowly. Every day felt longer than usual. Daniel worked his shifts, completed inventory reports, and drove the same roads through the Ohio countryside. But his thoughts kept returning to the upcoming meeting. At night, he reviewed the documents again. Each page seemed to contain another clue he had previously overlooked. References. Dates. Signatures. Connections stretching years into the past. Then Friday arrived. Shortly before lunch, a secure package appeared at his apartment. Inside was a collection of documents sent by Michael Bennett's office. Daniel spread them across the table. Most were legal records. Some contained terminology he barely understood. But one page stood out immediately. At the top was a valuation report. Much of the information had been redacted pending verification. Yet one line remained visible. Daniel stared at it. He read it twice to make certain. His eyes were not playing tricks on him. Whatever Carter Holdings actually was, it had not disappeared over the years. It had grown. Daniel spent the entire weekend studying documents he barely understood. The valuation report sat at the center of the kitchen table while stacks of supporting records surrounded it like pieces of a map leading somewhere important. He kept expecting to find a mistake. A misplaced name. An outdated account. Some obvious explanation that would bring everything back to normal. Instead, every page seemed to point in the same direction. Whatever Carter Holdings represented, it was real. Monday arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. Daniel drove to work before sunrise, passing stretches of farmland covered in a thin layer of morning fog. The radio played softly in the background, but he barely heard it. His mind remained fixed on one number from the report. Not the full value. That section remained hidden behind redactions. Just enough information had been left visible to suggest that the asset had appreciated significantly over the years. Far beyond anything he had imagined. During lunch, his phone vibrated. Michael Bennett. Daniel stepped outside the warehouse and answered immediately. I was hoping to hear from you, Michael said. I have completed another review. Daniel leaned against the brick wall beside the loading dock. And? The structure is more complicated than I originally believed. Daniel laughed quietly. That does not sound encouraging. Actually, it is the opposite. Michael's tone remained measured, but Daniel could hear something beneath it. Confidence. Your father appears to have been one of several early participants in a private investment partnership established decades ago. Over time, ownership interests were transferred through a series of legal vehicles designed to preserve long-term family succession. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. The words sounded like a foreign language. Can you explain that in normal English? Michael chuckled softly. It means your father owns something that continued growing after his death. Daniel remained silent. And based on what we have verified so far, Michael continued, his designated beneficiary appears to be you. For several seconds, Daniel could not think of a response. Forklifts moved nearby. Workers crossed the parking lot carrying clipboards and coffee cups. The world around him continued normally while his own reality shifted beneath his feet. How could I not know about this? He finally asked. Because the structure was never actively managed through your personal accounts, Michael explained. The records remained dormant until a periodic compliance review triggered an ownership verification process. Daniel looked across the lot toward rows of trailers lined beneath the afternoon sun. 6 months ago, he had spent weeks gathering financial records for the divorce proceedings. Attorneys had requested everything. Bank statements, retirement accounts, property deeds, investment portfolios. He had turned over every document he knew existed. Yet nobody had mentioned this. Nobody had found it. Nobody had even known to look. That realization stayed with him long after the call ended. That evening, he stopped at a grocery store on the way home. Nothing unusual. Bread, eggs, coffee. The same items he bought every week. Yet for the first time in months, he noticed something had changed inside him. The constant pressure in his chest had eased. Not disappeared. Just eased. Possibility had begun replacing survival. Later that night, Michael sent another secure packet. Daniel opened it carefully. Most of the information remained restricted pending final verification, but one newly released document contained a timeline of ownership transfers. His father's name appeared repeatedly. So did dates stretching back nearly 20 years. Then Daniel noticed something else. A handwritten notation attached to one of the earliest records. The signature belonged to his father. Beneath it were 6 simple words. For Daniel, when the time comes. Daniel stared at the page for a long time. For years, he had believed his father left behind memories. Maybe a few lessons. Maybe a few regrets. Now he was beginning to wonder if his father had left behind something far more valuable. Not money. Not yet. A second chance. 3 days later, Daniel found himself sitting inside a conference room nearly 400 miles from home. The law office occupied the upper floors of a glass building overlooking downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline while afternoon sunlight reflected across polished wood surfaces. It was the kind of place he had once entered regularly during his corporate career. Then life changed. Now, walking through those doors felt strangely unfamiliar. Michael Bennett greeted him with a firm handshake and a quiet smile. The attorney looked exactly as Daniel had imagined. Professional. Calm. Precise. The kind of person who chose words carefully because he understood their value. Several thick folders waited on the conference table. More documents than Daniel had seen in months. For nearly an hour, Michael reviewed records, timelines, ownership structures, and legal agreements. Much of it remained complicated, but one thing gradually became impossible to miss. Carter Holdings was not a company in the traditional sense. It functioned more like a container. A structure that held interests connected to multiple investments spread across different industries. Some had succeeded. Others had disappeared years ago. A few had performed far beyond anyone's expectations. Your father entered this partnership early, Michael explained while sliding another document across the table. Far earlier than most participants. Daniel studied the paperwork. Why did he never mention any of this? Michael considered the question. Based on the records, I suspect he viewed it as something intended for the future rather than the present. Daniel nodded slowly. That sounded exactly like his father. The man rarely spoke about possibilities. He focused on responsibilities. Throughout the meeting, Michael continued unveiling pieces of the puzzle. None of them felt dramatic on their own. Yet together they formed something remarkable. The investments had remained active. Management had changed hands multiple times. Ownership percentages had shifted. Markets had risen and fallen. Through it all, the underlying structure survived. Then Michael opened the final folder. Unlike the others, this one contained recently updated reports. The attorney took a breath before speaking. Mr. Carter, everything we have discussed until now has focused on verification. Daniel sensed the conversation changing direction. And now? Now we discuss value. For a moment, neither man spoke. Michael turned a page and placed a document directly in front of him. This report contained far fewer redactions than the previous versions. Daniel's eyes moved slowly across the numbers. Revenue projections. Asset summaries. Ownership calculations. At first, they meant nothing. Then his brain caught up with what he was seeing. He blinked once. Then again. That cannot be right, he said quietly. Michael's expression remained steady. We have reviewed the calculations repeatedly. Daniel looked down again. The figure remained unchanged. Not thousands. Not hundreds of thousands. Far beyond that. The kind of number that transformed lives. The kind of number people spent decades chasing without ever reaching. For several seconds, Daniel simply stared at the page. 6 months earlier, he had left a courthouse believing the most important financial chapter of his life had ended. He remembered sitting in a nearly empty apartment wondering how he would rebuild. Wondering whether he would ever recover. And now this. Michael folded his hands. There is one more thing you should understand. Daniel looked up. What is that? The ownership rights associated with this structure were never part of the divorce proceedings. Daniel frowned. Because nobody knew they existed? Correct. Michael nodded. Including you. Silence settled across the conference room. Outside the windows, traffic moved through the city far below. Inside, a realization slowly took shape. The future he thought had been taken from him had never actually disappeared. It had been waiting. Hidden in paperwork. Buried in time. Protected by decisions made years before anyone could have predicted how his life would unfold. And for the first time since opening that email, Daniel understood that the real story was no longer about what he had lost. It was about what had been quietly growing in the background all along. Daniel returned to Ohio carrying a slim leather folder and a reality that still felt impossible to process. The number remained the same every time he looked at it. No matter how many times he reviewed the reports, the ownership records, and the legal confirmations, nothing changed. The asset existed. It belonged to him. And most importantly, it had never been part of the divorce settlement. For nearly a week, he told no one. He went to work each morning before sunrise. He stocked inventory, completed reports, ate lunch at the same metal table near the loading docks. To everyone around him, he appeared exactly the same. The old sedan still sat in the parking lot. The small apartment still waited for him every evening. Yet internally, something had shifted. The fear that had followed him since the divorce was finally beginning to loosen its grip. One Thursday afternoon, Daniel was organizing inventory records when his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and froze. Rebecca. The name had not appeared in weeks. Communication between them had become minimal after the divorce. Mostly paperwork. Occasional administrative questions. Nothing personal. He considered letting the call go to voicemail. Instead, he answered. Hello? Her voice sounded unusually warm. Daniel, hi. I hope I am not interrupting anything. He found that interesting immediately. Rebecca rarely worried about interrupting anyone. I am at work, he replied. What is going on? There was a brief silence. Nothing important, she said. I was just thinking about you. Daniel looked out across the warehouse floor. Forklifts moved between aisles while workers prepared outgoing shipments. For a moment, he almost laughed. 6 months ago, during the worst period of his life, she had not called to ask how he was doing. Now she was suddenly thinking about him. That is nice, he said politely. How have you been? Rebecca asked. The question sounded carefully chosen. Busy. Still at the warehouse? Daniel noticed the detail immediately. She already knew the answer. Which meant she had asked someone else before calling him. Yes. That must be difficult. Her tone carried something close to sympathy. Daniel thanked her and changed the subject. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Yet when it ended, a strange feeling remained. Not anger. Not resentment. Awareness. Later that evening, another surprise arrived. An email. Not from an attorney. Not from a financial institution. From Rebecca herself. The message was friendly. Casual. She mentioned old memories. Shared a photograph of their dog from years earlier. Asked if he would like to meet for coffee sometime and catch up. Daniel stared at the screen. During their marriage, Rebecca had always been intelligent. She understood people. She understood timing. And her timing suddenly felt very interesting. The next morning, he forwarded the message to Michael Bennett. Less than an hour later, his phone rang. I had a feeling something like this might happen, Michael said. Daniel leaned back in his chair. What do you mean? Information moves faster than most people realize, Michael replied. The ownership verification process required communication with several entities. While everything remains confidential, rumors often travel through professional networks. Daniel thought about that. You believe she knows? I believe someone may have heard something, Michael said carefully. And that information may have found its way to the wrong ears. That night, Daniel sat by the apartment window watching rain slide down the glass. His phone remained silent on the table beside him. For the first time, he viewed recent events from a completely different angle. Perhaps Rebecca's sudden kindness had nothing to do with nostalgia. Perhaps it had nothing to do with regret. And if that was true, then the next chapter of this story was about to become far more revealing than the last. Rebecca's messages continued arriving over the next 2 weeks. None of them were dramatic. None mentioned money. At least not directly. Instead, they arrived wrapped in nostalgia. Old photographs. Memories from vacations. Stories about restaurants they used to visit together on Friday nights. The messages felt carefully crafted, like someone rebuilding a bridge one plank at a time. Daniel responded politely when necessary, but he noticed something important. The conversations always drifted toward the same destination. His life. His plans. His future. One Saturday morning, Rebecca suggested meeting in person. "Just coffee," she wrote. "No expectations. It would be nice to catch up." Daniel stared at the message while sitting beside the apartment window. Outside, leaves drifted through the cool autumn air. 6 months ago, he might have accepted immediately. Back then he was still trying to understand what had happened to his marriage. Still carrying questions that never received answers. But the man reading the message now was different from the one who walked out of the courthouse carrying a cardboard box. After several minutes, he agreed. The coffee shop sat halfway between their neighborhoods. A quiet place with brick walls, warm lighting, and large windows facing a tree-lined street. Daniel arrived first. He ordered black coffee and chose a table near the window. 20 minutes later, Rebecca walked through the door. She looked almost exactly as he remembered. Confident. Composed. Elegant. Yet something seemed different beneath the surface. She smiled warmly as she approached. "It is good to see you." Daniel stood and returned the greeting. For the first few minutes, the conversation remained comfortable. Work. Family. Mutual acquaintances. The weather. Safe subjects. Rebecca laughed easily. Asked thoughtful questions. Maintained steady eye contact. To an outside observer, they might have looked like old friends reconnecting after years apart. Then the conversation gradually shifted. "You seem different," Rebecca said. Daniel smiled slightly. "Most people change after a divorce." "No," she replied. "I mean calmer." He considered that. "Maybe." Rebecca stirred her coffee. "I worried about you for a while." Daniel found that statement interesting. During the months immediately following the divorce, concern had been noticeably absent. Now it appeared regularly. "I appreciate that," he said. Another pause followed. Then Rebecca asked the question she had been approaching all afternoon. "So what is next for you?" There it was. Simple on the surface. Important underneath. Daniel took a sip of coffee before answering. "I am figuring things out." "Anything exciting happening?" Her tone remained casual. Too casual. Daniel recognized it immediately. Michael had been right. Someone had heard something. Perhaps not details. Perhaps not numbers. But enough to spark curiosity. "Nothing worth talking about yet," Daniel replied. Rebecca nodded, though disappointment flickered briefly across her expression before disappearing. The meeting ended an hour later. They exchanged polite goodbyes and walked toward separate parking lots. As Daniel reached his car, his phone vibrated. A message from Michael Bennett. He opened it immediately. The attorney had forwarded a newly completed legal review. Daniel scanned the summary while standing beside his aging sedan. Near the bottom appeared a sentence that made him stop breathing for a moment. Final ownership verification complete. Beneficiary rights fully confirmed. No competing claims identified. Daniel looked up toward the cloudy afternoon sky. For months, uncertainty had controlled every part of his life. Now uncertainty was disappearing. The facts were no longer developing. They were established. As he drove home, another realization settled quietly into place. Rebecca had spent the afternoon searching for information. What she did not understand was that the most valuable thing Daniel had recovered was not hidden in legal documents or investment structures. It was clarity. And clarity was something no settlement could ever take away. Winter arrived quietly that year. By December, the trees outside Daniel's apartment stood bare against pale gray skies, and thin layers of frost covered windshields before sunrise. Life looked different now, though not in the way most people would expect. The ownership transfer process had been completed. Legal confirmations were finalized. Financial structures had been established. Yet Daniel had not rushed out to buy luxury cars or move into a mansion. In fact, very little about his daily routine had changed. He still woke up early. Still drove familiar roads. Still appreciated the simple comfort of a hot cup of coffee before work. The difference was internal. For the first time in years, every decision belonged entirely to him. One afternoon, Michael Bennett called with the final update. "Everything is complete," he said. "There are no remaining issues, no pending reviews, and no competing claims." Daniel stood near his apartment window while listening. Snow drifted slowly outside. "So that is it?" he asked. Michael laughed softly. "Most clients ask what happens next." Daniel looked around the small apartment that had witnessed his lowest moments. "I think I already know." After the call ended, he sat quietly for several minutes. He thought about his father. About the handwritten note hidden among old documents. About all the years this opportunity had existed without his knowledge. More than anything, he thought about timing. If the email had arrived 1 year earlier, the asset would likely have become part of the divorce. If it had arrived 1 year later, he might never have opened it. Somewhere between loss and recovery, life had chosen a very specific moment to reveal what had been waiting in the background all along. A few days later, Rebecca reached out one final time. The message was longer than usual. She spoke about mistakes. About perspective. About how much life had changed. She suggested dinner. Not coffee this time. Dinner. Daniel read the message carefully before placing his phone on the table. Then he walked to the window and watched snowflakes settle across the parking lot below. There was no anger left. No desire for revenge. No fantasy about proving anyone wrong. Those emotions had faded months earlier. In their place was something far more valuable. Peace. He sent a short reply wishing her well and politely declining the invitation. No arguments. No accusations. No references to money or legal documents. Just closure. The following spring, Daniel moved into a new home. Not extravagant. Not designed to impress strangers. Just a beautiful place with large windows, a quiet backyard, and enough space to build the future he wanted. On the day he received the keys, he walked through the empty rooms alone. Sunlight poured across hardwood floors. Birds sang somewhere beyond the trees. The house felt calm. Honest. Earned. Later that evening, he placed a framed photograph of his father on a shelf overlooking the living room. Beside it, he set the original handwritten note. 6 simple words. For Daniel, when the time comes. He stood there for a long moment, smiling quietly. The divorce had taken things he once believed were irreplaceable. The court had divided assets. Life had dismantled plans. People had made choices that could not be undone. Yet none of those events had written the ending. Because the most important thing Daniel recovered was never hidden inside an investment structure or a legal agreement. It was the realization that his future had never belonged to anyone else. And sometimes the greatest victory is not getting even. It is discovering that your life can become larger, brighter, and more meaningful than anything you thought you had lost.